I enjoy stories, and so remembering Paul Harvey was a fun one this morning. I got to meet Paul Harvey when I was a kid, and it was at an It Is Written partnership. He used to support the It Is Written ministry, and it was in the Marriott in Los Angeles, right near the airport there, and I loved Paul Harvey. If you know me and you come to this church, you know I love stories. And so it would only make sense that I'm a Paul Harvey fan. In my library, I have two Paul Harvey books that are kind of along the lines of this is the rest of the story. And they're old books printed in like 79 or 82 or something like that. But they're some of my favorite books because he always had some of the best stories. And he was a master storyteller as well. He would kind of leave you hanging, and then he'd fill all the rest in, and you're like, oh, that's the end of the story. Loved him as a storyteller. In 1912, October 14, outside the Hotel Gilpatrick in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Anybody been to Milwaukee, Wisconsin before? I have tons of family in Milwaukee. Hotel Gilpatrick in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, October 14, 1912. Theodore Roosevelt was preparing to give a speech. He had a 50-page manuscript for this speech. Anyone who speaks up front knows that is a massive speech. Most of my sermon notes are about 6 pages. I try to keep it to 6 pages with bullet points. But Teddy Roosevelt had a monster of a speech that he was getting ready to give there at Hotel Gilpatrick in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And right before his speech, he made a choice. And it didn't seem to be that big of a choice when he made it. But he needed to store his speech somewhere, so he double folded it. He had a big jacket on, and he opened up his coat and stuffed his speech into a pocket, this double-sided 50-page speech, so 100 pages double folded, into the coat pocket of his jacket. And that choice was about to save his life. Because as he was going into the Hotel Gilpatrick to make his speech, somebody came up with a .38 revolver and point blank shot Teddy Roosevelt right in the chest. Luckily for him, he had chosen that side of his jacket to stuff this almost publishable book of a speech in his jacket right here. Now, the .38 caliber bullet didn't completely stop. The speech didn't stop the bullet completely, but it did enough. He still had a flesh wound, and the bullet still lodged in his flesh, but it didn't go far enough to kill him. And being Teddy Roosevelt, he didn't allow this to stop him from giving that speech. He walked up to the podium, bullet lodged in his chest, bloodied manuscript still inside of his coat, and he got up, and he said this as he began his speech, and he pulled out the bloody manuscript. He said, "You see, it takes more than one bullet to kill a bull moose." That's a tough president right there. And he went on to give a 1-hour speech with the bullet lodged in his chest. And when he finished his speech, they rushed him to the hospital. That one choice, seemingly insignificant to tuck it in this jacket pocket, saved his life. One choice. We have lots of choices to make in life, don't we? You made a lot of choices today before you even came to church. You looked in your closet and you made some choices. Like, well, I'm going to wear this. Now I wore that already recently. I'm going to try this. Well, no, it's not Christmas yet, so we're not going with the full red. It's really funny to watch you here, by the way. When Christmas comes around, there's so much more red in the audience in church. Like, give it December 11 or 12. Maybe you look and you're like, ooh, fall colors. Yeah, we can still wear fall colors. It's still fall. Maybe you put something a little fallish on. You made a whole bunch of decisions already. We make lots and lots of decisions. On a yellow light, are you going to go for it or are you going to stop? You got to make a decision. How many of you go for it? Be honest. How many cautious ones don't go for it? Depends, right? Are you close enough? Are you too far away? Those are some tough decisions, right? My grandfather, who I'll tell you a story about him in just a little while, he always said this to me, and he said it in this kind of slow southern twang. He was a Texan. He said, James, he was calling me James. James, he said, green means go, red means stop, and yellow means go faster. That was his driving advice for me when I was getting my license. We have all kinds of choices to make in life. We're going to continue on in our story of Joseph in the Bible, and in this portion of the story, part 2 of our 3-part series on Joseph, Joseph has seemingly insurmountable, almost impossible choices to make in his life. Almost impossible. You look at the scenarios, and we just get a little bit of a snapshot into Joseph's life. But the portion of his story where we're going to look at today, the choices that he has to make are unbelievably hard. Unbelievably hard. Last week, we looked at Joseph being sold as a slave by his brothers. Sold to family members, the Ishmaelites, cousins. He's sent off to Egypt, and he is bought by a man named Potiphar. Turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. And the idea of being a slave is a horrible prospect. To be shopped around, to be inspected like a piece of merchandise has to be so humiliating. Wondering whose house you're going to end up in, if they're going to be nice to you, if they're not going to be nice to you, not knowing what your life is going to be like, but knowing that you really have no control over what happens in your life. You are owned. And this is what Joseph is facing. He's on the shopping block to be purchased. Verse 1 of chapter 39 says, Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. I love how it starts right off of that. Here's what happened to Joseph. This is terrible. He was just bought as a slave, but God was with Joseph. Joseph was not alone as a slave. He didn't have to go through all this by himself. God was with Joseph from the very beginning. And he was a successful man, it says. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. Joseph spent 10 years in Potiphar's house as a slave. 10 years. That's a long time. Think about how old you were 10 years ago. And then think about where you're at now and everything that's happened in between then. That's quite a bit of time that's gone by, hasn't it? That amount of time is how long Joseph spent as a slave in Potiphar's house. He was 17 years old when he was sold. So now he's how old? 27 years old. And the Bible tells us that Joseph was pretty easy on the eyes for the ladies. He was a good-looking guy. If a lady passed him on the sidewalk, it was probably one of these, wow, did you see that guy? He was a handsome guy, a very good-looking man, and a man of 27 years old. In the book Patriarchs and Prophets that tells a little bit of the story of Joseph, on page 214, the author says this. He was here in Egypt, exposed to temptations of no ordinary character. The sights and sounds of vice were all about him, but he was as one who saw and heard not. His thoughts were not permitted to linger upon forbidden subjects. For Joseph, he had been taught about God from his father. And as we talked about last week, those things were huge in his transformation from being a favored son to a slave. Those lessons stuck with him, and that transformation, it became his God instead of his parents' God. Those lessons stuck so strongly that in this foreign land where there were temptations all over the place, Joseph had committed in his heart and his mind to stay faithful to God and to not waver in his morals and in his decision making. With all of these things all around him, I love how the author says this, it was as if the temptations weren't even there. And she gives a hint as to how he did it. The author says that he didn't allow his thoughts to linger on those temptations. Now, every single one of us here have temptations. And they're all probably different for each and every one of us. How is it that we overcome temptation? How is it that when we're faced with two different choices, that we can make the best choice? Here the author says, don't let your thoughts linger on those temptations. We're all going to face temptations. It's not even a sin to be tempted. It's what we do and choose to act on that makes it become a sin. And for Joseph, in the midst, he didn't have a church to go to on Sabbath. In fact, things were made extra hard on him. And yet, Joseph determined in his heart that he would honor God and do what was right. And he wouldn't even allow his thoughts to linger on those temptations. Friends, when you are tempted, as you are probably every day, be like Joseph. Don't allow your thoughts to linger on what your weaknesses are that the devil tempts you with. Choose in your heart to honor God and to do what's right. There's a quote, you've heard me say this quote many times. It's a quote from another book called The Great Controversy. And the quote says this, do what's right because it is right and leave the consequences to God. Do what's right because it is right and leave the consequences to God. This kind of sums up the story of Joseph. He saw all kinds of temptation all around him. How was he able to do this? It continues on in this book, Patriarchs and Prophets, page 217. Joseph's gentleness and fidelity won the heart of the chief captain, who came to regard him as a son rather than a slave. The youth was brought in contact with men of rank and learning, and he acquired a knowledge of science, of languages, and affairs, an education needful for the future prime minister of Egypt. Even when Joseph was a slave, God was preparing him for the next step. Actually, 2 steps later. As he's in the midst of, he doesn't have any freedom. He could have thought, man, this is terrible. Where is God? Why am I a slave? Why is this happening to me? Where is God when I was sold on the block? Those questions could have been there, but Joseph had a different attitude and a different perspective when he was faced with terrible times. Joseph did his best as a slave. You ever heard the Bible verse, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might? That's kind of a hard one if you're in the middle of a terrible, terrible situation, isn't it? You're not really motivated to do your very best when you're going through something hard, are you? And yet Joseph, this is his second massive trial. He was sold, now he's a slave, and yet Joseph does his very best. In fact, it implies that he became to look towards his slave master almost as a father figure. Potiphar certainly looks at him like a son. Potiphar trusts him so much because he's doing such a good job that he says, look, Joseph, I'm putting you in charge of everything. Just make sure I've got food on the table. That's all I need is to have food on the table. You're in charge of the whole house. And as the chief guard in the most powerful nation on the planet, I imagine it was a pretty good-sized house. Talks about him having fields. I'm sure he wasn't the only person, not employed, but as a slave there. He's in charge of everything. The success of the house is in Joseph's hands. He trusts him that much. Man, what an incredible person Joseph must have been. To have been thrown into a horrible situation like this and to say, you know what? I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to do my very best because that's the right thing to do. Boy, that's a hard thing to go for when you're struggling with something in your life that doesn't seem fair, isn't it? You don't really want to do your best when you feel like you're kind of under the thumb and getting just squished. And yet Joseph does his very best. He's in charge 10 years. He spends in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar is married to Mrs. Potiphar. And I can't imagine that Mrs. Potiphar was the ugliest lady in Egypt. I imagine that Mrs. Potiphar was a pretty good-looking lady. Her husband was one of the highest-ranking men in Egypt. He probably could pick anyone he wanted. And Mrs. Potiphar thinks that Joseph is very handsome. And Mrs. Potiphar does not have the same moral code that Joseph has. And in verse 7 of chapter 39 in Genesis, it says, "And it came to pass that after these things, that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she tried to seduce him." Now, one of humanity's weakest areas, an area that has caused people to complicate their lives probably more than anything else, is in the area of morality. The temptations there for humans are strong. The weaknesses for humans in this area are strong. And the devil tries to use this on Joseph. She made requests, and it would have been easy for Joseph to oblige those requests. It's a big home. Husband's busy. He's gone a lot. It would have been very easy to do this for Joseph. Joseph was a normal man. He probably looked at her and thought, oh, she's very pretty. But he did not allow his thoughts to linger there. That's huge. Verse 8. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, I like how it's just look, hold on a minute, look. My master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Isn't his answer interesting? There's a twofold piece here that is part of his conscience. First of all, he knows he would be wronging Potiphar and sleeping with his wife. But more important to Joseph is that he acknowledges that in doing this, he would be sinning against God. That is what is most important to Joseph. And he is able to withstand this very strong temptation because of his faithfulness to God. It would be wrong to do this to Potiphar. And because of that, he won't do it. But that's a small part of his reason. he believes correctly that it would be wrong to do this, and he would be sinning against God. He's 27 years old. Verse 10, so it was that she spoke to Joseph day by day. Every single day, the temptation was there in the home. Every single day. And every day, he does not allow his thoughts to linger there, and he stays strong. But it happened about this time, verse 11, when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men in the house were inside, that she caught him by the garment and tried to seduce him again. He left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. So it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men in her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought in to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." And she goes on to accuse him of doing something horrible, brings it to her husband's attention. And Potiphar is in a very, very tough situation. Because if Potiphar thought for one moment that Joseph had actually done this, that would have been Joseph's last day alive. It would have been very easy for him to kill a slave. Very easy for an offense like this. He wouldn't even have to ask anybody's permission. He would exact that right there in his own home, and he would kill Joseph for that crime. But there's no way he believed that. And then you can tell by where he's placed that he doesn't believe that either. He's placed in the king's prison. This is probably the most privileged of all the prisons. This is where people who serve Pharaoh are put if they've misbehaved. Now, the other prisons, probably nowhere near as good. He's placed in this sort of special prison. He's not executed. It says, verse 20 in chapter 39, Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But listen to this, verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph. Friends, there is no scenario in your life, no matter how hard it is, that God is not with you there. God is always right by your side, no matter what it is that you're going through. And God was with him there and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all of the prisoners who were in the prison. Wherever they were, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him in whatever he did, and the Lord made it prosper. Have you ever heard of a jail where a prisoner was brought there for his crimes? And the jailer, the head guy of the whole jail, was like, you know what? Here's the keys to the whole, I like you so much. Here's the keys to the whole jail. I'm going to put you in charge. You're still a prisoner, but I'm going to put you in charge of everything. I trust you. Not many jailers are like, yeah, I trust these guys. I'll give one of them the key. I've never heard of that in my life except for this story. Because even in jail, being falsely accused, Joseph made a choice to still do his best in whatever he was doing. This is a little bit mind-blowing for me, because I ask myself, what would I do in Joseph's shoes? I've been betrayed by my family. I've been sold as a slave. I've worked as a slave for 10 years, did my very best. And what's my reward? I get falsely accused and thrown in jail. Why would I have any motivation to do my best? And yet Joseph, whatever his hand finds to do, he does it with all of his might. What a tough scenario for Joseph. Again, in the book Patriarchs and Prophets that tells the story of Joseph, On page 218, it says, Joseph's real character shines out, even in the darkness of a dungeon. He held fast his faith and patience. His years of faithful service had been most cruelly repaid, yet this did not render him morose or distrustful. He had the peace that comes from conscious innocence, and he trusted his case to God. He did not brood upon his own wrongs, but forgot his sorrow in trying to lighten the sorrow of others. Man, it's almost superhuman. I look at this and I read this and I think, how could he be like this? Joseph, in the midst of all this, is looking to see how he can help other people. How can I be a blessing to people in the midst of this trial? That's what's going through his mind. And I don't know if I could do that. That's what I would pray for, and that's what we have as an example. And I think that's something for all of us to strive towards when we're going through this. To challenge ourselves and to say, okay, I don't know why this is happening to me. I don't know why I'm suffering like this. But I'm going to try and bless somebody else and help somebody else. And that might be Joseph's secret into his own happiness and his own sanity. Because no matter where you are, you can always help somebody else out. And I think the definition of a blessing is by seeing how people respond when we help them out. And we see how it changes people and helps people. And the feeling we get in our soul, I think, is maybe what's the definition of a blessing. And Joseph went through all this and said, how can I help somebody else out? And oftentimes, when we're going through something and we help somebody else out, we realize, hey, somebody else always has it worse off than we do. There is always somebody else going through more than what we're going through. And Joseph spends his time doing his best and helping other people out, even though he's been falsely accused of a terrible crime and is paying the time for it in jail. This is an incredible man. Joseph spends 3 years in jail, falsely accused. He runs into a couple of people. The butler and the baker of the king come through because this is a special prison. And this shows a little bit of what Joseph was like. He's in charge of the prison. He comes by, and both of these guys, they're in the same cell, and they both look terrible this morning. Something is clearly wrong, and Joseph notices this and sees it as a chance to minister to these guys. He says, guys, I see the long face. What's wrong? What's going on? I've met people who've been to prison today, and the warden never said that to them. Not once. Guys, you look sad. What's going on? Joseph was this kind of warden. Guys, I can tell something's wrong. What's going on? They both said, we had a dream. And in the back of Joseph's mind is probably thinking, yeah, I've had some dreams. Still waiting to see what it means, but I've had some dreams. He says, well, what are your dreams? He says, they said, we don't understand the dreams. He's like, why don't you share them with me? I know a God who interprets dreams and gives dreams. So one guy says, yeah, this is what the dream happened. It was a good dream. He goes through the details, and he says, okay, your dream. He says, mine was a terrible dream. I died in my dream. After all the details, Joseph says, okay, here's what these mean. He says, you, after 3 days, you're going to get your job back. You, after 3 days, are going to be executed. That's what your dream means. That's kind of a tough dream to have to interpret for somebody, right? That's some pretty bad news to have to share. And it happened just like it did. And Joseph says to him, hey, to the guy who was going to make it and go back and get his job, he says, hey, remember me when you go back near Pharaoh. Tell my story. I shouldn't be here. I was wrongly accused. Now, he's doing his best, but he still wants to get out of jail. He's a regular guy too, you know? He doesn't enjoy being in jail. He wants out. Tell my story to Pharaoh. So it just happens just like God shared with Joseph. One guy gets his job back and the other guy gets executed. And yet the chief butler did not remember him, but forgot him. Pharaoh has a dream. A while later, he has two dreams, in fact. He sees one group of 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows come up and eat the 7 fat cows. And then he has another dream where there's 7 thick heads of wheat and scrawny heads of wheat come over and eat those, and he doesn't know what to do. Nobody knows what they mean. And the chief butler is like, oh, I am a terrible person. I totally forgot to share the story of Joseph with Pharaoh. He goes to Pharaoh and he says, Pharaoh, there's someone I know. And I know him and I know he can help you out. Let's call him. So Pharaoh says, okay, get him in here. And the Bible says that Joseph was called. He had to shave because he's been in jail for a long time, so he probably has a big beard by now. They had to shave him, get him dressed in some new clothes. They bring him to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, here are the 2 dreams. Joseph listens to these 2 dreams. And in chapter 41, verse 25, Joseph explains what these dreams mean. He tells them that the 7 fat cows and the 7 full heads of grain represent 7 years of plenty, and that the 7 scrawny cows and the 7 scrawny pieces of grain represent 7 years of famine that are coming, 14 years. And then Joseph kind of presumes to give some advice. He says in verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning wise man, set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store them up, and they will be a reserve. Now verse 37 says, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said, can such a one be found as this, and a man in whom is the Spirit of God? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all of this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in the garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the 2nd chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh. Without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath. Man, this is just like the craziest day in Joseph's life. He goes from a prisoner to the 2nd most powerful man in the world, and he gets married all in one day. I mean, this is like life-changing. He has a new job. And in all this, Joseph had given credit to God. Pharaoh had said, hey, I heard you can interpret. He says, no, there's a God who interprets dreams, and he'll tell me. And Joseph goes from slave to prisoner to vice president. And he's the 2nd most powerful man on earth. And the Bible says that Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. One thing that I see in this story is that bad times don't last forever. They don't last forever. There's a song there's a kids movie, Cars, that's really fun. My kids enjoy that movie, and there's a song in there. And the words of the song go like this. It says, behind the clouds, the sun is shining. Believe me, even if you can't quite make it out. You may not see the silver lining, but there's a big blue sky waiting just behind the clouds. I love that song. It's a dumb kid's song. I love it. I've learned to play it on the guitar. Sometimes I'll sing it and play it along. It's a really fun song. But the words are what are really cool because it reminds us that though we will go through storms in this life, the storms don't last forever. There's a big blue sky waiting just behind the clouds. And for Joseph, he remained faithful to God through all of this. There's not one negative thing said about Joseph in all of this. And I find that mind-blowing. absolutely mind-blowing. I often, as I was reading through this, I wondered, I'd never thought of this before, I wonder if Joseph ever ran into Mrs. Potiphar at a party. They were in the same social circle again. I wonder if he was ever at a Pharaoh-oriented party, and there's Mrs. Potiphar, and he was like, howdy. Fancy meeting you here. Wonder if they ever said anything. Wonder if she apologized. They had to have run into each other, don't you think? Joseph chose to remain faithful to God despite all of the circumstances that he faced. Continuing in on the book Patriarchs and Prophets on his life, page 223, it says, minds thus disciplined are not wavering between right and wrong, like a reed trembling in the wind. They are loyal to duty because they have trained themselves to habits of fidelity and truth. By faithfulness in that which is least, they acquire strength to be faithful in greater matters. An upright character is of greater worth than gold. And friends, no matter where we are in life, we can choose today, regardless of our past, to stand firm for God today and from here on out. Joseph is such an inspiration to me and hopefully to you in this life, and looking at someone who was able to withstand temptation and to stand firm for God and for principle. There are temptations everywhere in our lives, and we have to purposefully choose to remain faithful to God when temptations come our way. My grandfather, the one who gave me the driving advice on red and yellow and green lights, his name was Don Houghton. And he was a pastor and evangelist for 50-some years. And my grandfather didn't have an easy life. When he was 21, I think, he was working in a wood mill. And this wood mill, lots of saws and things like that, and they didn't have all the safety equipment now that they did in about 1945 or so. And at 21 years old, his hand somehow got stuck, and the saw blade went right across and cut off the 4 fingers on his left hand. And I saw a picture of my granddad just a couple years ago where he was like 18 and he had all his fingers. And I was like, wow, I've never seen a picture of granddad with all of his fingers. Because he was so young, 21 years old when he lost his fingers. When he was, I think, in his early 30s, he had a stomach problem. And back then, their solution was to go in and remove half of his stomach. Later on, I think 70% of the people who had that surgery ended up getting stomach cancer, which he did as well. And so he dealt with the stomach cancer in his 50s, I think. He, as long as I knew him, struggled with headaches, migraine headaches, terrible, debilitating headaches. In the last few years of his life, they'd found sinus cancer and had to go through in his nose, and his nose was scarred up, and he had some scars up on his forehead as well from some of these surgeries to get rid of all the cancer that was in his face. And his whole life, my grandfather suffered physically. Pretty bad. And yet, I've met a lot of people who've known my grandfather. I knew him for 38 years or so, 37, 38 years. He passed away about 4 years ago. Never once did I ever hear him complain about going through all this stuff, all these many surgeries, back surgeries. He had back surgeries on top of all that. Never once did I hear him complain or even throw out a comment that sounded doubtful about God being with him or caring about him. Not once. Even when he was suffering and was just feeling terrible or recovering from a surgery, never once did I ever hear him question God about that. And he died in his sleep in his own bed had a heart attack, just didn't wake up one morning. And looking back on his life when we did his funeral, there was story after story after story about my granddad and how he focused on other people and helped other people instead of complained about the stuff he was going through. And those stories, we all look back and we're like, that was totally true. He didn't complain about stuff. He was always looking out and helping other people when he could. And I think that's what helped him keep his focus off of his own problems and keep his focus on helping other people. And friends, looking back at the life of Joseph, I think there are some key things we can learn from him that will bring us closer to Jesus and will keep us closer to Jesus when we are facing faith-shaking trials in our lives. First of all, remember that God is with you in those trials. Over and over in this story, when he's sold as a slave, the Bible says, but God was with him. When he's wrongly accused and he goes to jail, the Bible says, but God was with him and blessed him. Friends, there is no trial that you will ever go through in your life where you are going through it alone, because God will be with you just like he was with Joseph. Second, when you face temptation, may you face temptation with the same firm foundation that Joseph did, and be able to stand up strong against the winds and say, this is right and this is wrong, and I am going to stand for what is right. May you also have the patience to realize that God is a God who takes tough situations and turns them somehow into a blessing. Oftentimes, we don't know how God does this. And for Joseph, sitting forgotten in a jail, for Joseph being sold as a slave, it may have been hard for him to think, how in the world can God bless me? How can these dreams come true? Those must have been just from eating too late at night. And yet Joseph stayed firm in his faith in Jesus and became unshakable. Friends, may all of us have that resolve to stay faithful to God like Joseph did. When we face temptations, when we're going through dark times, may we be reminded that God is close to us just like he was close to Joseph, and he will help us make it through. And beyond the clouds, the sun is shining. These things don't last forever. And soon Jesus is going to come, and there will be no more trials or temptations. And the words I think that we all want to hear are, well done, good and faithful servant. Welcome into the house of the Lord. May we remain faithful like Joseph till Jesus comes. I want to invite our worship team to come up. We have a closing song that is so appropriate for this story. The song is called It Is Well. And the words to this song says, when peace like a river attends my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. And the third verse, I love this. It says, and Lord, haste the day when the face shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. I invite you to stand and sing this song from your heart.